Good morning, good afternoon, good evening as appropriate. My name is Gary Blatt, and today we are going to be talking about designing Teams hierarchy. And so our agenda, hopefully that we'll be able to execute without too much trouble, is a brief introduction. We're going to cover just some high-level Teams basics to make sure that everybody's on the same page. Then we're going to dive into the meat of the presentation, which is talking about what is a hierarchy and the details behind that, the considerations when it comes to designing a hierarchy. Hopefully, I will be able to technically pull off a demonstration, and then we will have some resources listed for your edification. And of course, we will have some Q&A at the end as well. So let's get rid of some logistics here. The lovely folks at Microsoft 365 Collaboration Conference wanted us to remind you that they are planning on being in Vegas next year. And also thanks to all of our sponsors that have so gratefully sponsored the event. And you can see that information at the end as well. So let me introduce myself. My name is Gary Blatt. I currently live in Tampa, Florida in the US. I have a few acronyms after my name with some certificates behind that, I suppose. I am a solution architect for SharePoint resources. I guess one of my biggest claims to fame is I had the opportunity to do a deployment for 60,000 users in a global SharePoint 2007 environment. So those of you who had been working with the product that long would know that that was certainly a challenge, back in those days. And we did have a successful deployment. I am currently focused on Teams, SharePoint, the Power Platform, integration, and whatever else they may throw my way. And as you can see, I am so devoted to SharePoint that when I moved here to Florida, I made sure that I got the appropriate license tag SharePoint for my vehicle. So introductions aside, let me dive right in here. The first mile, what we're going to cover here is the team basics, the core functionality of Teams, discussing the differences between communications versus collaboration, as well as the concept of the SharePoint integration available in the Teams environment. So when we talk about the core functionality, I grabbed the Microsoft definition. It's always good to know what the person who produced the product thinks the product actually is. So I do like their definition. You can see that, they define it. It's a collection being the key word there, being more than one, people, content, and tools around different projects. So in their definition, they do specifically refer to this, as project-based. As you'll see when we go through my presentation, that there are other options for designing your hierarchy. Projects is one of them, and we'll certainly cover that. But when we talk about the core functionality within the Teams environment, I have separated it into two main categories, one being communications and the other collaboration. Of course, to be clear, before I go any further, I will say that there's a lot of cross functionality, so that when you are in a meeting, for instance, we have that under communications because you're doing an online meeting and potentially communicating back and forth. But that meeting can also have a chat associated to it. That meeting can also have files associated to it. So when we say that we are separating things into categories, it's mostly for the purposes of classification. Be aware that Teams does provide that cross functionality. So when we talk about files, yes, that mainly falls into the collaboration category, but because files also have the ability to have conversation around the files, well, that's also falling into the communications category. So the main intention here is to make sure that you are clear that the collaboration and communication pieces do intermingle quite a bit, but sometimes it is very effective to separate them to a certain extent as you are working on the design of your Teams environment. So today we are going to be focusing on what we consider the collaboration pieces. That would be mostly the main Teams functionality and the files functionality, even though those other pieces do come into play. So communications, that would be the top level, the meeting, the chat, and the call features. This is similar to what was found in Skype, as Teams certainly fulfills one of those needs to replace the Skype product, which will go end of life shortly. The collaboration piece is the files, the apps, and other sharing features, and we'll cover that in a little more detail as we talk about the factors to consider when designing your hierarchy. And to be clear, the collaboration features are the focus of this presentation. As I said, they do cross each other quite a bit, but for today's purposes, we are going to try to stay focused on the collaboration pieces. So I have another chart here to kind of show how there is cross collaboration and communication across the main features. And, it's just a reminder that, oh, I see I am having some network bandwidth issues. I'm going to go ahead and turn off my video. I think you've seen enough of my beautiful mug, and maybe that will increase my network bandwidth there. I apologize for the technical issue. So the collaboration features, mostly the files feature, is going to be one of the main focuses of when we talk about the designing of the hierarchy. So another piece to be very aware of, whether you have a background with SharePoint or not, is keeping in mind that anytime that you create a new team, that does two main activities in the background. One is it creates a new Office 365 group, just as if you had done that within your AD environment or from directly within SharePoint. And then it goes out and creates a SharePoint site to support that team. So while Teams does provide that front end, if you will, to the SharePoint that it's using in the background, all of your files that are stored in that particular team are stored actually in that SharePoint environment, and you can actually access them inside of the SharePoint environment. There is a tab, a menu option within Teams that does allow you to jump directly to the SharePoint site and that specific document library that is set up for that team. So again, the level of integration with SharePoint is very tightly integrated. The other thing to be aware of, not everybody knows, is that all of your chat and meeting texts, which are persistent, unlike in Skype, where when you close the session, they go away, though your organization may have those being saved, separate but related issue. The chat and meeting texts that are entered into your teams is actually stored in SharePoint as well, both for archive purposes and for the ability to go back and review them. So the SharePoint integration is a very important piece to keep in mind when you are designing your hierarchy. Those of you who have that SharePoint experience previously will know that SharePoint's been out almost 20 years now. And one of the biggest challenges that we have had over the couple of decades it's been out is creating and maintaining that hierarchy within SharePoint. In SharePoint, you have site collections, which contain one or more sites. You have the sites that contain one or more libraries. And so it has that inherent hierarchy built into it. But figuring out the best way to create that for your organization has always been a challenge for SharePoint architects over the years, not only in gathering the proper requirements from the customer, but also from the perspective of, when it comes time, when a user asks for a new document library in SharePoint, do we have the processes in place to determine, well, does that belong as a new document library within the existing SharePoint site that they're already using? Or based on security and a potential other host of variables involved, do they go to a whole new site or potentially even a whole new site collection? And so those challenges that we face in the SharePoint environment are just as relevant within Teams. And as a matter of fact, they become even more relevant because there are plenty of people who are responsible for the architecture of Teams that don't have that SharePoint background. and may not have the full awareness that they are, creating this back-end hierarchy within SharePoint that requires maintenance and plenty of other, challenges that can meet that. So the SharePoint piece, if you have the SharePoint background, you already probably are aware of that. If you're new to SharePoint, I highly recommend, checking out some of the links available. There are plenty of posts regarding, best practices for creating the SharePoint hierarchy. And lo and behold, those would certainly be applicable, to creating your team's hierarchy. Though again, there are some differences, and we'll certainly cover that as we proceed through the presentation. So here we are, mile marker 5. We're progressing through our marathon here, albeit a little slowly. This is getting to the meat of what I wanted to share with everybody, which is, what is a hierarchy? You can get that textbook definition, but being able to show some examples and provide some guidance on that is certainly the intention here. So the dictionary definition, anybody could get this off of Google. It's that concept of, I have an example here of an org chart. Most of us are familiar with that concept. There's the president of the company, and underneath him might be the C-level people, the CIO. Underneath them are department level managers. Underneath that are the worker bees. So we have this hierarchy that most people are pretty familiar with, regardless of your technical background. Notice that in the definition, it refers to the groups being ranked one above the other according to status or authority. I don't know if that's necessarily applicable in the tech world, but I suppose it could be, depending on your perspective. But the idea is that, SharePoint, the predecessor, the groundwork to Teams, was very much predicated upon this concept of a hierarchy, and how best to implement it and create it has been the topic of discussion for years. And so Teams is no different. It's very easy to go into Teams and just haphazardly start creating teams and channels and throwing content up in there. And, initially that may not present any initial challenges, but over time, both from a maintenance perspective and a security perspective, and, all the other factors that architects need to take into consideration, all of that comes into play. So from a text definition, in the Teams environment, the high-level hierarchy is at the top of the hierarchy are teams. Within teams, you can have one or more channels. And then within those channels, you can have content. And of course, content is a very generic term. We are going to, during the demo, cover some of the different types of content and potentially where they should go within the channel and how they should be presented, because those should be all part of your hierarchy design decisions. With teams being at the top of the chain, and content, the important part, what the users are going there for, down at the bottom. So as I state here, it's very easy to create a new team. Again, there's permissions and other factors involved with that. But, the simple act of creating the team is pretty simple. Adding channels and content, are also very simple. And therefore, that's really the big challenge. It's almost too easy. And so, this is where, we talk about the big G. So those of us who have been doing architecture and design, either formally or informally over the years, know that governance, is a very big topic, depending on the size of your organization, whether you're an employee or a consultant to the organization, there's many different relationships, but trying to convince, management based on, whichever role that you're playing, that governance is a very important aspect that should be taken care of prior to launching your environment, has always been a challenge. And so sometimes, we're coming into existing environments, realizing that there is no governance, and attempting to get the approval to spend some time doing the governance. And where that governance comes into play is specifically for things, plenty of other topics under governance, of course, but specifically around in the Teams environment, who can create new teams, who can create channels, who has the permissions to, execute different activities within the Teams environment. I have had the opportunity in the couple of years I've been focused on Teams, that some organizations of a variety of sizes choose to leave it wide open. Let's just leave it at the default setting. In general, that is certainly not recommended. Again, we all face different challenges in our environments, but leaving it wide open certainly would give you much more of an opportunity to have anarchy, chaos. All of those terms could certainly be applicable to a mismanaged Teams environment, just as it has been for many years with the SharePoint environment. So here's a hierarchy example. This was intentionally set up, for this demo. It certainly was not a production environment that I have set up and running, but I have this labeled. What's wrong with this picture? So let's take a look at this and talk about some of the issues here. So the lack of naming consistency. Yes, I used my name Gary in a couple of the team's names, so maybe that could be considered consistency. But in general, in a enterprise environment or even a small business environment, it is certainly recommended that you potentially set up some governance around your team's naming, which is certainly an important part of the design. You may want to come up with a certain prefix or a certain suffix or both. Potentially. You may decide to use acronyms that are applicable to your organization. In IT, we always have that challenge. We do tend to love our acronyms because it takes up less space. Space is always an issue. The space that a team name takes up, is certainly a factor, in the display. But at the end of the day, the goal here when you're naming your teams is to make it applicable to the user. In a lot of organizations, users could have anywhere from 1 to 1,000 teams that they have access to, and so being able to quickly look through the list of teams that they may have permissions to and say, oh yeah, that's the one I'm looking for. It's all part of going back to the old days of web development when we had that whole drill down concept. So that refers to the idea of you would start at the homepage of a website, and if you were looking for a specific topic, the search engines weren't that great when we first started back in the 90s, and navigation wasn't all that great. So the only way to get to the topic that you were looking for was start drilling down on the menu. So while I'm at menu level 1, let me click on that. Okay, now I see a whole nother choice. Let me click on one of those. Okay, and eventually through that drill down mentality, you would find the topic that you were looking for. Over the years, as our tools have grown more sophisticated, we are certainly hoping to get away from that drill down mentality, providing tools such as search and other things that would allow the users to locate. And Teams is no different. It does have search capabilities, and if you do have that many different teams or channels that you can't remember the names of, using the built-in search functionality is certainly one of them. So, from a naming perspective, the second bullet here, the personal names, you can see, I have Gary Larry, Gary Private. It's great that my name's in there because it has relevance to me, but, it may not always have relevance to everybody else involved. And in addition to that, what if they leave? Okay, so you've created a team that has all of this content in it that's called Gary's channel. And, at some point, Gary decides to move on. It then presents a challenge because now you are maintaining this team that has a relevant, name reference. And technically that could be, part of the sunset policy that you may have in your governance for when does the team get retired? Because again, those of you familiar with SharePoint would know that, there are ways of setting up SharePoint to automatically, get rid of and retire sites that haven't been used in X amount of months and don't have activity. So, maintaining that, we'll talk about the maintenance aspect in a few minutes, but, it's certainly another factor as you name these. Also, you may notice the team in the middle there, gaming. In this particular case, that I can tell you is a personal thing. Do you really want to mix personal and business in your enterprise? Obviously, in general, that's not a good idea. But, I have seen examples of this where somebody who has the permissions to create a team will go in and say, yeah, here's a great topic. Let me create a team for X. And so one of the things that I want to continue to point out is with a lack of governance and oversight, if everybody can create a team, you're going to find that people will not think twice about creating one. Hey, I just spoke to Bob in accounting, and he was telling me about this new initiative that's coming up. It's not a project yet, but I'm going to go create a whole team just for me and Bob to talk about that. In my opinion, that's probably not an appropriate reason to create a new team. But if that governance is not put out in advance before you even launch the team's product to your organization, then users aren't going to have that guidance. And as we all know, nothing against the users, those pesky users always doing their tricky things. Even if you do provide governance, they will sometimes ignore it. I know, shock of shocks. But at least if you've published the governance, then you have the ability to turn around and say, yeah, but we told you don't do this. And that's why we went in and deleted your teams, And so all of these are additional variables and factors involved when you as the architect or the person put in charge of designing it, you don't necessarily have to be an architect, to design the team's layout is, what are the main principles? What are you trying to accomplish within your organization? So that leads us up to mile 10. We're almost halfway there through our marathon here. I did consider making it a half marathon at 13 miles, but I couldn't find the right numbers. So here we are at mile 10. In this section, we want to talk about the hierarchy guidance. What are some of the things that you need to take into consideration? And also, the maintenance aspect. So it's not just the usage of it, but it's also for the people who are responsible, even if that's not you as the potential architect or person responsible for creating it, you need to consider the people who are being chartered with maintaining all of the teams. And hopefully during our demo, we will cover a little bit of that as well. So when we talk about hierarchy guidance, there I go with that big G word again, governance. I can't seem to get away from it. But, one of the best guidance tips that I can offer is when you deploy your configuration of teams, support the governance. No matter how little that governance might be, and it could be that governance is only in your head and was not documented and it was not shared with the users, but, at least having some concept of the constraints that you would like to put out there. And of course, the very first one that, I have listed here is not allowing all users to create teams. And in all fairness, there are certainly going to be organizations of a variety of different sizes where that is the right thing to do. So I'm not suggesting that it's never appropriate to have all your users with the ability to create teams, but without proper training, without proper user adoption, and without proper governance, you are kind of setting yourself up for potential disaster. And, I get that there are scenarios where you only have so much say in that, and you do your best to, inform the appropriate people, and you do the best that you can. The other factor is, setting permissions in general. For instance, who can create channels? When we get into the demo, I will take a look at that. This is not meant to be a complete team's how-to in general. Our focus is on designing a hierarchy, but I really cannot emphasize enough how all of these other factors, security and governance, and come into play when you are designing your hierarchy. And getting that right the first time in is pretty critical. So one of the options that you have, and again, those of you with that SharePoint background, probably know this, canon as well, is, do we model this on an existing org chart? Do we have, at the top, finance, HR, and IT? These are all, common departments across most organizations. And then within finance, you would have potentially other channels that could include both public and private. We'll cover that topic in just a moment. But, when somebody is looking for a certain piece of information, if it's something about their pay or their benefits, they're going to start looking inside of HR. So a lot of people are very comfortable with that concept of being able to see at the high level, oh, here's a departmental, I know my company's org chart, or I at least have some perception of it. And let's take that approach. Let's, model all of our teams at the top level should, be that department name, that is appropriate in some organizations, but especially in the larger organizations, it becomes almost inconsequential, because then you end up creating 32 channels just for finance because there's so many subtopics. So are you better off creating finance 1, 2, and 3, of course, giving them different names as appropriate, but having 3 different finance teams, and then grouping the functionality or the categories of functionality within each of those teams. Just as in SharePoint, there are certainly security issues, to be concerned. Who should have access to the data that's being stored? As I mentioned in the last bullet here, channels can be both public and private. So just as in SharePoint, where we can have, permission settings that allow a library in a SharePoint site to have different permissions than the full site itself. It's a similar concept with the channels. And just as in SharePoint, where we have that concern about breaking the inheritance that is inherent into SharePoint, so that we can support that, it gives you pause to take a step back and say, well, wait a minute, maybe I don't need a private channel here. Maybe what I need is a separate team that has a whole different set of permissions. So, that brings up the whole security factor when you're designing your hierarchy. Should security be the only factor? When you're deciding, do I create a new team or do I add a channel to an existing team? Security is certainly one of those factors, but I would suggest it's certainly not the only one by any means. So here we have a very simplified, graphic. Notice that I pointed out that each individual team can have a secure channel within it. So, the org-based approach, allows for designing and creating in advance, meaning that when you start with an org chart or an org-based, chart, that, hey, I have these many departments and each department has this many subcategories. I can lay all that out in advance. I can get approval on it. I can get sign off on it. I can create all of that before I even launch my team, my team's environment. While there will obviously be adjustments and changes to that, as there would be in any environment, the ability to create all of that in advance, is very valuable. The other major choice, of course, is a project-based approach, which we'll talk about now into the next slide. So again, here is a project-based approach. A very typical thing. You'll notice that this particular graphic that I borrowed shows that all of the teams have the exact same structure, because that is the high-level functionality available in teams. They didn't necessarily go in and create channels that had specific functionality. That is essentially what the out-of-the-box functionality is within the team's environment. But I still like the graphic, so I borrowed it. The idea is that this lends itself to much more of a dynamic on-demand approach. You may gather requirements from your users in advance. You may talk to them about what it is they think they need. And that's different potentially if you're an outside consultant or an internal employee. You may have some in-house knowledge. But either way, if you take that project-based approach, it really requires a lot of advanced thought and the concept that more than likely you aren't going to have your entire team's hierarchy designed in advance at launch, because we all know how challenging it is to gather requirements from the users. No matter how good your interviewing skills are, no matter how good your requirements gathering skills are, you're never going to get them all. And so therefore, you certainly need to consider that even with the org-based approach, that there's going to be potential updates. But in a project-based approach, there tends to be a lot more updates to it, especially after initial launch, when a user will go to the support team and say, hey, there's no place for me to stick ABC. And so, that can certainly lead to, well, okay, I'll go create you another channel. But in my experience, just as with the whole SharePoint, being very similar, in years of that, this can lead to chaos. I mean, allowing your users to go in and maybe not create new teams is helpful, but if they have the permissions to create new channels, kind of ad hoc, on one hand, it reduces the support calls to your help desk. I get that factor. It certainly reduces the support factor, but in reality, it certainly lends itself to creating an unmaintainable environment potentially. And so the other thing that I will mention as we look at this graphic that has the cookie cutter approach showing here is that during build last week, we got some great news that the templates for Teams is finally been announced, and I will stand corrected. I think it's a Q4 release for those of you who are on GA only. But it is certainly in the works and gives us as designers and architects that ability to go out and model a team with the proper channels, save that as a template, and then just as we do with SharePoint templates, use that as an opportunity to enforce a certain amount of governance and say, sure, you can create a new team, but this is what it's going to look like, and maybe enforce that they can't change that, or maybe they can make certain modifications to it. There's certainly several different options there, but that template approach could potentially make your job significantly easier when it is time for you to consider how you're going to create your hierarchy. So while that may not do you any good when you're deploying your hierarchy, in the very short term now, or may have already deployed it, I would certainly recommend following the Office 365 roadmap website and making sure that you are, up to speed with, when that's coming available, depending on your release channel, and making sure that, you get some early access to that if possible, because I think that will go a long way towards assisting you, with that concept. So again, in that same vein, as we look at this cookie cutter approach potentially, we know that certainly it's never one size fits all. So, managing from a design perspective, well, how do I start with a template and then allow for exceptions to that? Should technically be part of your design. If you have the time to do that type of lower level implications in your design, it's certainly recommended to account for that as part of your design, knowing that there's going to be updates to it, and here's how those updates should be handled. So when we talk about maintenance, maybe as the architect or designer, the person being made responsible for managing how the teams are being set up and the channels and all of those pieces, you may not have direct responsibility for the maintenance aspect, but if nothing else, what you have to consider is that if you set up your team's hierarchy to support 1,000 teams versus 100 teams, that's tenfold the amount of potential maintenance that has to be done by the admin, whether that's you or not. Some shops you wear every hat, some shops you have a very focused, set of roles and responsibilities. But in this scenario, maintenance should be considered upfront as you're doing your design, so that you can be very aware of the implications. So I grabbed this screenshot from the Teams Admin Center to point out those of you who may not have admin access to it, the information that's available at this level. When we get into the demo, I can drill down onto that and show you a little bit more, but it gives you the name of the team, how many channels are in it, how many members are in it, how many of those how many owners are in it, which is a separate number. So team members, owners, and guests, add those together, and that's the total number of people who have access to your team's environment. The number of members can impact your hierarchy decisions as well. If after you've deployed your design, you're going back and checking on your teams and seeing how the users are adapting to it and using it, and you see that a team that you designed that you thought was going to be used by maybe 10 users, and you laid out the channels with that particular concept in mind, now has 1,000 users, or whatever some ridiculous number might show up. That should raise a red flag, because as part of your design, you're going to be making decisions about how many channels to have within your teams, how to organize them, and the more people accessing your environment, the more that comes into play. You may decide that if I have a channel for discussing hierarchy, as a particular example, but I have 1,000 people. Do I really want 1,000 people all chatting in one persistent chat window? That's going to get pretty unmanageable. So volume becomes yet another factor when you're talking about designing the different aspects to your hierarchy within the team's channel relationship. It may be appropriate to have 1,000 users, assigned to a team, although not necessarily recommended. But you may not want to have them all having access to every channel within that team, because again, the volume of chat and the volume of all of the other data being stored, could get quite onerous. So something to keep in mind is, what's the planned number of users for a particular team and or channel within that team? And depending on your roles and responsibilities, you may have passed this responsibility on to a different person. But whoops, sorry about that. But at the same time, it wouldn't be a bad idea if, after going live, you did some monitoring to see, okay, well, when we started, we only had 10 members here and 1 guest. Now I have 47 guests. Well, wait a minute, maybe they're doing something different with that team than I had originally intended when I designed that layout. Just as when we create SharePoint sites and site collections and libraries and all those assets within a SharePoint environment, we do have, as designers and architects, certain goals that we have when it comes to designing the teams, and we have things in mind. As we know, there's pesky users again. They'll come in there and they'll start doing things that maybe you didn't intend, for that site. And that's where that maintenance becomes a huge issue. And so we certainly want to try to make that maintenance as manageable as possible as part of your design. That was the main point to get across with that particular slide. So now, as we're nearing the end of the marathon here, and we're at mile marker 20, I am going to get brave enough to switch to my demo, hopefully. I have tested this previously, but as everybody is aware, demos never go 100% correct. So I am going to switch off my sharing for just a moment to switch it to a different sharing mode here. So bear with me a moment. And let's switch to this, sharing this. And let's get logged in there and get logged in there. And yes, I want to stay signed in. And lo and behold, here is my team's admin center. So from a maintenance perspective, if you do have access to this, again, depending on roles and responsibilities, you may find yourself with the responsibility of designing your team's environment, but not having access to the admin center. Again, every organization manages this differently, potentially. But if you do have access, you can come into the teams. The dashboard is great, just like all of the other dashboards Microsoft has provided in the 365 environment. It has great summaries and has the ability to be customized. If we were to click on Manage Teams, and of course, depending on the size of your teams and the quantity, I have a customer that has almost 1,000 teams. That page takes a little bit longer to render. And so what you're seeing here is, you saw some of this in the screenshot previously, is that you have this list, here, it's a pretty straightforward. It's only 15 teams, very, very manageable. Obviously, this is one of my test tenants that, I use for multiple different purposes, mostly testing. And so you can see that the member count and the guest count, all of these are very low. But also take note that the privacy level is also listed, because not only do channels have the private and public aspect, but at the teams level, And so that should certainly be part of your design. As you'll see when we jump into the Teams demo itself, hopefully. You know, when you create a team, you have several options, and one of those is this a private team, or is this an org-wide team? So there's certainly implications there when you go to create it. As the designer or the architect for creating your hierarchy, it is highly recommended that that's part of your design. It's designating, is this private, is this public, and potentially listing the groups that should have access to the private areas, to make sure that that's clear. From a maintenance perspective, it's very nice to be able to come in here and see at the team's level, how many channels do I have? How come my company has 5 and everybody else only has 1 or 2? It's that type of thing that provides that ongoing maintenance of a hierarchy. There are some architects that will design a system, hand it over to the implementers, the build run guys. They will deploy it, and the architect moves on to a whole different task, a whole different client maybe, and never gets to follow up. Those of us who have the opportunity to have that follow up get to learn valuable lessons. Well, this is what I designed, but holy moly, I got in here and a month later, I take a look at my initial creation and what have they done? And of course we have that issue regardless of the environment that you're working in, but Teams certainly, has that potential to be even less, governed and less organized, just because a lot of people move to Teams as a last minute, we all now have to go remote. There was that huge surge in the, usage of Teams. Hopefully you've seen some of those numbers that Microsoft has been publishing that are quite encouraging, that include quite a bit of different, volume numbers that are just mind-blowing. So from a maintenance perspective, I mostly just wanted you to see that, this information is available for follow-up afterwards, and that it gives you a lot of potential for saying, hey, I was thinking A, but now that it's been active for a month or 2 or potentially longer, and I see the way that the users are actually using it, yeah, I'm going to update my governance. I'm going to update my design. We're going to go in and make some deployment changes. We're going to change some security. In a perfect world, that would be a living, breathing task. Doesn't always happen that way, but when you have that luxury, this is certainly one of the tools that will help you with that. The next thing is I'm going to bring up this Teams environment. And what I've done here is I've created a couple teams down here to show some of the differences from a project-based perspective. So we talked about that org chart, finance, HR, IT, and then channels underneath them. We talked a little bit about the project-based approach. I used a very informative team name, Project-01, and I did that intentionally. I will never pass an opportunity to share my obsession with governance. So, the Project-01, yeah, not very helpful. You certainly want to try to get much more meaningful names. You don't want a 300-character name either, but, at the same time, you certainly want to be able to, present meaningful naming. But here we are with Project-01, and if I expand it to look at the channels, I have the default general channel, and then I have budget, development, and project plan. Okay, they seem to be reasonable channels. The channel for budget, may have some Excel files involved and some chat, around that. Even, meeting chat associated to budget meetings and all of that could be stored in that channel. Development, would potentially, well, I, again, left it generic. Is that business development or is that coding development? Who knows? Because we just called it development. Somebody looking at it may not be clear. So another great example of, using some more clearly defined naming conventions. And the last one being project plan. Again, these are generic categories and they may be appropriate for your environment. And that is certainly one way of designing a project layout. But let me give you a gander at Project-02 over here. So Project-02 has exactly one channel. That's it. What I've done there, because we haven't talked a lot about this, given the time constraints I had in this presentation and my propensity for talking, we didn't talk very much about tabs. but technically that is part of your hierarchy. It's akin to, in the SharePoint environment of having different libraries and, different lists, and things like that, which, by the way, you can have direct links to your SharePoint assets, added into your team's environment. But from a design perspective, what I've done here is taken the concept of, well, hey, I got these 3 topics. I spoke to the users that are running this project, and they have these distinct needs, and we determined that, budget has its own need and development and so forth. But that doesn't mean that you need the 3 separate channels. From a functionality perspective, I have one channel, and what I've done here is I talked to the budget people, and as it turns out, all that they really had was the need to just share an Excel spreadsheet. So I uploaded that spreadsheet into the Teams files area, and then created a new tab. And here's my fancy pants Excel spreadsheet with deep, financial information in it, as you can see. For those of you who may not have seen this before, this is, just pointing to the file that's already stored within your channel in that Files tab. But what you're doing is, instead of making the users go to the Files tab, locate the file, click on it, and launch the file, you're making this available at the tab level. And for some users, this is what they understand. It's a much easier to consume interface because they don't have to go searching for the file. That files area could have 3,000 files in it. And again, even though we have the search tool, not all users know how to use it or are willing to use it. So by throwing it up here on the tab list, we've made it very simple. I came into Project-02, or hopefully better named, and hey, I'm looking for the budget. There it is right at the top of the tab list. So it makes it very simple to locate. And here, the great integration with the Office products allows them to do anything they would normally do within the Excel product, or Excel Online, I should say. But they're doing it to some users. They don't have any clue that they're, using Excel Online. All they know is, hey, I clicked on budget and look at this. It looks just like Excel. And not to take away from the intelligence of some of our users, but, some understand it at that level. In this interface, they have several additional integration levels, including being able to add comments, open it up in the desktop app, all kinds of different things, as well as multiple users inside the same file simultaneously. That's all part of, the online experience. Even before Teams was released, that was available. What Teams has done, of course, is put a nice wrapper around that. So for the development, I shortened it to dev just to keep the physical space it was taking up shorter. And in this case, it turned out all they needed was a Word document. So I was able to, this is the important dev stuff, and there's my Word document. For the project plan, it turned out that they didn't really need project necessarily, which does not currently integrate indirectly. But there's planner. When you click on that add a tab button, your mileage will most definitely vary. This is my test environment where I have no restrictions and no policies. And as you can see, not only do I have the Office apps available, but I have every app in the whole catalog. I got all the goodies available because this is strictly just a test environment. In an enterprise environment, that would hopefully be more restrictive. But the concept is that you have the ability, given proper governance and security and everything else, to go as far as, adding the tab to an external website or internal, and so there is a ridiculous amount of integration. How does that impact you as the person responsible for designing the hierarchy? Well, as you just saw, there's 2 different ways, whether I use channels or tabs, when I'm designing my hierarchy. I have seen some architects, as well-meaning as they are, go through the experience of saying, well, I'll create the teams, and the users will figure out what channels they want. Or I'll create the teams and the channels, but it's up to the users to decide what tabs they want. And in some environments, that's appropriate, and in others, it's a nightmare. Again, your mileage may vary, most certainly. So, hopefully, in the short time that I had here, I've been able to give you some insights into the variables. I certainly, as you can tell, didn't give you the panacea for everything. Here's the exact way of doing it. Here's the answer, the ultimate answer to doing it. But hopefully I've given you some, food for thought as to, what are some of the factors involved, and the things to consider. Everybody has different circumstances and environments that they're working in, but again, I hope that that's giving you some insight. I am going to change my sharing yet again very quickly here, back to my slide deck. And, or at least I thought I was. Sorry about that. Yeah, I got to have at least one technical glitch. Yes, I want to share. Yes, I want to go here. Oh, come on. It's a conspiracy. All right, we'll give it one more try. Share desktop. Yes, I know it's going to replace. There's the slideshow I'm clicking on. Oh, that's because I was in my RDP session. There we go. And so, thank you for joining us. We are at the finish line. And I want you all to be very afraid. I would say that in all the years I've been speaking, both in person and virtually, I have never finished exactly on the dot. So that's something to be very concerned about. And take note of the Superman guy. I'm just saying. So just real quick, the deck will be available as well as the video for downloading. There are some of my resources, including my contact info. If you're not aware of it, there is a raffle going on. As an owner of an Oculus Quest that has become addicted to it, I can tell you that those are very cool. Thanks for joining us. Please, the feedback is invaluable to us, both at the event level as well as my speaker feedback level. And so, again, thanks for joining. And I believe, and one last thing, of course, is the consider donating to the charity